So I'll read out the introductions now. And I'll begin with our, to my left is Miriam Ticktin, who is Professor of Anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. Formerly, she was Chair of Anthropology and co-director of the Zolberg Institute for Migration and Mobility at the New School. She's a Rhodes Scholar, received PhDs from Stanford and from the École des Hautes Études. She's the author of Casualties of Care, Immigration, and the Politics of Humanitarianism in France, and co-editor of In the Name of Humanity, The Government of Threat and Care. And that was with Ilana Feldman, whose book I just taught 5 minutes ago. She was a founding co-editor of the journal Humanity, an international journal of human rights, humanitarianism, and development. To the left of her is Anooradha Rao, probably known to most people here, who's a professor of history at Barnard College, but also at the Department of Middle East, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia. And she's also been a longtime director here of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. For a decade, Anu edited the journal Comparative Studies in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And she's the major convener of the Ambedkar Initiative, which is a huge initiative directed from ICLS. Anu is the author of The Caste Question, published with California Press, and also the edited volume Gender, Caste, and the Imagination of Equality. And with Vandana Sonalkar, she co-edited the book The Many Worlds of R.B. Moore, Memoir of a Dalit Communist. Finally, we have Hibu Buakar, Associate Professor in the Urban Planning Program at Columbia's GSAC. Hibu is the author of For the War Yet to Come, which is a sad and an apt title. For the War Yet to Come, Planning Beirut's Frontiers, which won the 2019 Nikki Keddie Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association. And it also won the 2019 Anthony Leeds Prize from the Anthropological Association Society for Urban Anthropology. Hibbert co-edited the book Narrating Beirut from Its Borderlines, and that incorporates ethnographic, historical, archival research, along with art installations, architecture, graphic design, and photography, to explore the segregated geographies of contemporary Beirut. She also directs the newly established post-conflict cities lab at GSAP. And finally, we're here to celebrate the work of this book, Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab Refugee Camps and Humanitarian Settlement, by our main speaker, Anooradha Siddiqi. Anu is professor in architecture. She's the author of the book we're all here to hear about. And she's also co-editor of the book Spatial Violence, which was first published as a special issue in Architectural Theory Review. Anu has written extensively in journal articles, exhibition catalogues, public criticism. She also has a sustained publication record in teaching how to think about teaching in and out of the academy. It's a personal pleasure to introduce Anu. I teach her work in my classes on urban anthropology. I have been waiting for this book. And even though I've taught her work considerably, the book is radically different and much more extensive. Anu is someone who is constitutively collaborative. This book is the work of Anu, but absolutely Anu reaches out across the university, across disciplines, across the world. It is also the sum total of all those collaborations. So there's a lot of people in this book, even though she is the main author of it. And it's a pleasure to welcome her here today. Thank you, Anu.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you. It's just a privilege to engage this work with all of you and to see so many aunties and uncles of this book in the audience. Is this, it's working? Oh, thank you. So I would like to begin with some acknowledgements and thanks, also by way of grounding the frameworks of the book. First, to elders and communities in Dadaab and in refugee camps around the world who have much to teach us. I'd also like to thank my parents and my family for a great deal of daily support. As you know, this is a launch supported by the Heyman Center, the Institute of African Studies, the South Asia Institute, and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. I'm grateful to the staff and faculty associated with each of those. But holding this discussion in the Heyman Center is particularly meaningful to me because as I argue, the book is precisely a cross-disciplinary humanities study of subjects that are typically pursued in drier policy and practical spheres that are intentionally or inadvertently operating to control and regulate migration. A humanities lens enables a discussion predicated on the principle of open migration. I want to thank the chair of my department, Karen Fairbanks, advisors for the doctoral dissertation research that informed this book, Jean-Louis Cohen, Sally Engel-Mary, and Thomas Keenan, and long-term collaborators for our crucial discussions, Bazira Zomindar on partitions, Holly Amber Kennedy on settlement, Rachel Lee on collaborations, and the artists and intellectuals at the Go Down Art Center in Nairobi who have grounded and expanded my perspective. And I'm grateful to many mentors on this campus and would particularly like to mention Mabel Wilson, who has graced the cover of this book with her assessment, and who also laid the ground for an understanding of architectural history within theoretical frameworks for Blackness, a global Africa, and critical theories of race, which underpin this book. My book is also indebted to the 4 scholars at this table who carved a space for it. My book shares with Hibas the knowledge that built environments are anticipatory and that anticipation has the capacity to be hopeful. It shares with Anu's work the insistent gaze on long gendered entanglements between colonialism and humanitarianism. With Miriam's, a concern for the double-edged politics of care and the material and sensual habitats of border worlds. And with Brian, a call to see in material infrastructure a conceptual structure and the foundations for narrative. So I just want to thank you all for tonight and for your profound scholarship. I'd like to be able to advance slides. Can I do that? Oh, is that this? The book begins with the claim that a refugee camp is not an object. And I came to Dadaab first and foremost as an art and architectural historian, asking, what do we learn when we look closely at a refugee camp? What does its architecture trace? While this question of representation is not this book's only interrogation, it is the one that unlocks others. The term architecture can imply an aesthetic regard at the expense of exigent human need. But I've tried to argue for a different kind of urgency in the direct entanglement of aesthetics with politics. This book reverses the conceptual terms in which architecture is allocated to the subsidiary position of signifying a political framework, and instead argues that constructed environments and spatial practices act to construct political subjecthood and historical consciousness. My book brings into focus spatial and material histories related to one set of refugee settlements from which we can draw many other concept histories. In 1991, near the village of Dadaab, Kenya, close to the border with Somalia, the UNHCR initiated an emergency intervention, a relief operation in the form of a temporary encampment into which 3 generations of people have since been born. Its remarkable scale of operations as a humanitarian site is brought about by the mass confinement of people by the state. Its design for perpetuity can be understood as a material mirroring of the breakdown of the government of Somalia, signaling the sunset of an ideology of the liberal nation state and its overt transformation into the system of the security state. In my book, I follow individuals who have lived and worked in Dadaab, refugees and aid workers who together constructed the camps. This book sees them as architects and their work as an architecture of migration. The camps they have designed and constructed are a racialized architecture, yet they inscribe complex African ways of knowing, based fundamentally on migration rather than fixity. My book analyzes the ways we can understand this complexity and how it provides us with historical and aesthetic knowledge. We can understand this through the very simple exercise of studying two produced images of the same architecture. This one by an aerial satellite survey team commissioned by the UNHCR to produce demographic maps to calculate humanitarian need, yet amounting to sanctioned surveillance. And this one, produced as part of a body of concerned photojournalism, operating beyond witnessing toward aesthetic registers and even engaging in the networks of art museums, yet telling a very different story than the bird's eye view. This image speaks of dwellings that embody generational knowledge, the East African Tukul, whose habitation of the land has been deformed. The pastoral economy and its reliance on the abundance of land resources for the raising of animals would disallow the zoning and aggregation of so many tukuls together. The examination of the tukul in different ways in multiple chapters of the book is an examination of a gendered mobile architecture, a recalcitrant architecture that refuses to comply with civil code and civil infrastructure, but offers its own migratory archive and episteme as the primary architecture in the camps. This book works against the putative fixity of architecture and the certainty imputed to the landed archive, and instead insists on migration as its own form of knowledge. Through the Dadaab refugee camps, I examine an architecture that its residents have called an open-air prison, which at once has constricted movement and sedentarized people, and also iterates longer migratory lifeways and traditions. Thinking with the Dadaab refugee camps allows us to imagine and emplace the wider landscape of migration, regional and global, present and past, which takes form in the Kenya-Somalia borderland. My book offers a concept history that uses these camps and the condition of migration as a method to study settlement. Through the architecture of the camps, I examine a long regional and global history of what I came to understand as humanitarian settlement. This paradox of settlement in the precise moment of emergency becomes apprehensible in the infrastructures of designing and making of the significant constructed environment of Dadaab, which I extrapolate to understand the making of precedent environments. The precedents I explore in the book include liberatory and coercive settlements in East Africa. The putatively liberatory abolitionist settlement of Freertown, established in 1875 near Mombasa to house people who had escaped or been liberated from enslavement, was a social crucible predicated upon the settlement of African land, which entangled rescuer and rescued in the enclosure of a Christian mission that equated the cultivation of plots with a moral life. The coercive settlements that precede Dadaab are the Shifta villages, in which pastoralists were detained, many whose descendants themselves ended up confined in the Dadaab camps, unable to move freely, to seek education, or to work, wholly dependent upon aid. The Shifta wars and detainment strategy, which nearly annihilated an entire pastoral way of life, of course finds its precedent in the detention manyatas or villages for anti-colonial Mau Mau, in some cases with the very officers in the Imperial British Army seconded to newly independent Kenyan government military to detain pastoralists from the Northeast, the area where Dadaab is located. This long history of detainment and settlement, of forced migration and forced settlement, is also a long story of the eradication of migratory ways of life and the continuous sedentarization of people in enclosures, especially people who relate to the land through migratory means, who live on the land rather than off it. In this way, the book is fundamentally a meditation on architecture's relationship to land. By examining the paradox of humanitarian settlement, it holds land politics at its center. Dadaab's historical particularity doesn't come only from connections to spatial forms expressed over the past 2 centuries, but from more recent trajectories of spatial practice within the post-World War II international system. The singularity and iconic role of the Dadaab refugee complex in the history of the international aid system belies its appearance as a provisional environment constructed only to respond to emergency. Another story is told by its concrete local and global infrastructures and designed architectures such as this and this. Each part of design initiatives undertaken by NGOs and explored within a series of design histories in the book that considers the irony of signature practices of design embedded within emergency relief as a function of design itself acting as infrastructure. Historically, more than any other documented emergency environment, Dadaab has functioned as a significant duty station for institutionally trained architects, arriving from around the world to work as physical planners and enabling important experiments in architecture and spatial practice. Through Dadaab, the book explores shelter design initiatives as signature practices, which paradoxically provided forms of patriarchal rescue while containing and scaffolding insurgent forms of domesticity in emergency. While the book examines that embedded life of architecture, it also shows how the structure of the complex of settlements iterates decades of emergency relief and physical planning expertise, providing a test bed for design and emergent and spatial practice implemented worldwide. For example, in the well-known Al-Zatari camps for Syrian refugees, often discussed in terms of their design. Dadaab has thus played a significant part in the global history of architecture and an international field of humanitarian practice. This drawing of the first camp at Dadaab by an architect commissioned to plan another is one of the first documents made of its architecture. In gathering this and other documents, I constructed an archive of a provisional environment, in part to demonstrate how it could be done. The UNHCR classifies sensitive documents for 20 years, a period intended to outlast the life of a crisis or a humanitarian operation. As we know, they last much longer than this. But I found that some of the records not deemed politically sensitive were highly sensitive in another sense. These were reports by architects, professionals trained in aesthetic matters, quite different from the utilitarian aims for an emergency response. Among many sorts of artifacts, I gathered architects' drawings, aid workers' videotapes. This document, leading to the establishment of the camps, a faded, nearly illegible fax transmission from UNHCR Nairobi to Geneva headquarters, warning of the amassing of people at the border with Somalia in 1991. Archival images of food distribution centers, the core and most charged space in a refugee camp, and my own photographs from Dadaab, materials whose publication cast the book itself as an archive. I see this archival work as a bridge for the many people for whom Dadaab is or has been home, to find and articulate their own histories and to exercise their own historical consciousness as and when they wish. One of the ways I tested this engagement with architecture and history was to invite several artists to draw Dadaab. Engaging artists as a methodological practice of historical scholarship offers a new approach, and rather than relying on maps and drawings from agencies controlling migration, I sought expressions in solidarity with open migration, such as these works by Abdul Fattah Adam, expressing the larger territories with which Somali people identify. His comment here on partitions concerns a root problem and foundation for all the arguments in the book. What do we learn when we look closely at a refugee camp? My answer is that this architecture is the materialization and an afterlife of partitions. In the book, I examine partitions of the land and partitions of the self as a racial act and architecture of doubling, following W.E.B. Du Bois and Achille Mbembe, and contributing to larger processes of underdevelopment in Walter Rodney's articulation. It's my contention that there's work we can do to move away from what I've come to call partition thinking. I hope my analysis of humanitarian settlement and a knowledge gained through knowing Dadaab takes us in that direction. Thank you for engaging this work. And thanks to all of you.
And now we'll pass over to Hiba.
Hello, everyone. It's always great to celebrate a colleague's published book. So congratulations. I know this is amazing. It's a fascinating book. And thanks for the Human Center for hosting us here. So, of course, everyone reads, when we read a book, we read it from our own perspective. So here's my reading of Anoo's work. So throughout this book, I felt that Anoo was grappling with the theorizing and operationalization of two concepts that are in the title. One is architecture of migration, and the second is humanitarian settlement. And the tension lies in how to conceptualize the architecture of migration within a framework where the theory and practice of architecture are inherently rooted in the concept of settlement itself. So how do you think about migration and its architecture when architecture is about settlement itself? So three crucial points I feel I would like to highlight in this book, and they're as follows. Firstly, taking the architecture of, Anoo asked us in this book to take the architecture of impermanency seriously to understand life in and through displacement. She elucidates the perspectives derived from a Western-centric architectural education, wherein the architecture of refugee camps is often perceived as composed of lightweight, additive elements constructed from found, recycled, and discarded materials. However, this aesthetic approach tends to cloak and conceal the cultural significance of these spaces, as per Anoo, rather than making it discernible. Dadaab, for instance, is often reduced to appearing insubstantial, resembling little more than shanties and huts in the bush. Nonetheless, it's essential to recognize that these spaces serve as the everyday living environment for millions of refugees over decades in Dadaab and other refugee camps. Despite the concerted effort of political powers and humanitarian agencies to enforce the transiency of camps, politically, socially, and architecturally, refugees and migrants inevitably transform tarps, huts, tents into places they call home, because many of them have to stay in these places for many decades. The architecture of migration thus challenges us to take seriously the labor of these individuals in transforming these artifacts of, we can call them artifacts of migration and refugeeness, into spaces that are conducive to their social lives. Thus, taking the architecture of impermanency seriously, and by doing that, it asks the readers to take the life that refugees make in these spaces as a way to understand life in displacement and migration in general. When most people lose their political rights, they move from being citizens in a country to be transformed into humanitarian subjects, the subjects of humanitarian aid rather than political rights in a different country. And while in theory this is seen as structures of impermanency, it's in fact a myth, because most of us who work on refugees or who had any experience with refugee displacement know that people mostly don't go home, that very, very few refugees over time globally have actually went back home, which is the assumption that underlies most humanitarian interventions, that it's just a temporary situation that will get resolved. Most refugee camps actually live for decades, and many people do not go back home. So they have to establish life in these new spaces. And so this is a fact, as I said, a myth, and it goes on for decades. And therefore, it requires thinking not only of humanitarian agencies and the international aid organizations and NGOs as actors in the setting up of these camps, which is usually what is thought about in these maps that Anoo showed, but also of the refugees themselves as architects invested in building their new lives in a new environment, far away from the villages, towns, and cities from where they came from. And so this quote from Anoo, this knowing, and I cite her, this knowing is held within an architecture of migration, a concrete and tenuous equimateriality of mirror of Mabaru stokes and age aquifer, a town with shops and houses, camps and compounds with offices, residents and restaurants, and a worldwide infrastructures for communication, transportation, and storage. It's the architecture of this international aid migration as much as that of people who make these international constructs like the tents and the tarps home for decades. So refugee camps are not supposed to leave a trace, but they do. And the refugee camp as an architectural end of what Anoo calls an architectural end of humanitarian practice, actually it's double-folded. It aims to encourage and at the same it discourages migration. This conundrum transforms the refugee camp from a site of aid for those who need, that's a monument if provisional of a humanitarian ideal, to a site of concentration which contours larger histories of detention, unquote. So my first question to Anu is then, what does it mean to recognize these spaces as architecture? So what do we gain from thinking of this as architecture? What are the political, material, social implications of calling it architecture of migration rather than something else? And what does it mean to bring the question of architecture and the concept of architecture to bear upon thinking about refugee camps? The second point is the politics of just enough architecture, which I'm fascinated with. And so basically, it's about sticks and tarps that make a tent for 15 people, a garden that produces enough veggies for one family. Everything in camps and in humanitarian aid is about the just enough. This is very complicated. This is new for me. So in this in this architecture, there's no excess. Excess is not allowed. It's architecture of the bare minimum, basically. In fact, the just enough is a humanitarian concept that gets operationalized in its most dystopian forms in a place, not only in Dadaab, we can think of the Gaza Strip. So through decades of the Israeli siege over Gaza, just to learn from some other place that has refugee camps, and the extreme case, which is Gaza, Gaza becomes the area in which Israel can create famine but chooses not to. Documents released, for example, by the Israeli defense ministries show formulas for calculating the amount of commodities allowed into the strip, setting a lower line for when shortages are expected, but also ignoring that warning, and an upper line above which even basic humanitarian items were blocked. So it's basically the logic of the just enough that allows people to live and survive and not die on the humanitarian or the settled colonial watch, but also not survive with any excess. And so I was fascinated with this concept of the architecture of the just enough of the refugee camp. And the camp becomes a formalization of this international humanitarian intervention and becomes a space where there is a continuous manufacture of scarcity and of what constitutes the barely enough. This process has systemized under development through the construction of a global industry refined to respond to emergency and relieve the suffering of individuals, rather than supporting the construction of a political community or a resource or mutual aid. And I think refugee camps like Dadaab is on the fringe of these kind of discussions of how do you create a barely enough while people are pushing to create a home in a place that they've been living in decades for. This idea of just enough is not only operational under conditional of settled colonialism in Palestine, but also their general, the modus operandi of the humanitarian aid politics, humanitarian aid political industrial geopolitics industrial complex, where the UNHCR and other international aid organizations have to answer to these regimes of barely enough because of how much money and political interest and how much power they are given to operate, how much goods they are given, how to get the goods into the camps or into Gaza or on these kind of marginalized spaces. So what is basically happening with UNRWA as we speak, as we talk tonight. It is that humanitarian spatiality that shows the intersection of the politics of the just enough architecture with the everyday practices of refugees who have to live under these conditions, but who also have to continue to live their lives, making do with the international regimes of the just enough to build a life within that just enough architecture. The third concept that I was interested in is I would like to highlight what Anu's grappled with throughout the book again, which is making the case that spaces and territories like Dadaab are socially spatially produced as architecture with history. And that's also another interesting idea that I felt like Anu was trying throughout the book to make the case that this is a space with history. That's an architecture with history. And I agree with her that most of the assumption about refugee camps and refugee life is that people don't have a history in that space, or they're just floating. There is no rootedness, there is no futures, there's no past. It's just like a present situation. And so it becomes a question about how the political here is to assert and to some extent prove that refugees have a history, that the land they move to has a history, in this case a colonial history, and how a camp will rewrite the unofficial history of a land that became contested through colonial pursuits and divisions of land. What does it mean to produce evidence of a history for refugees and their camp? Is that to show their humanity? Does that make it possible to not write? Is that to make it more difficult to write them off as disposable? And who skillfully connects that to the colonial history of the land of the camp that made it possible for this land to become the site of an emergent territory and to eventually become one of the most famous refugee camps in the world, called Dadaab, which is considered like a model for other refugee camps. So what does it mean to think about politically, socially, and economically of an architecture with history. While, as Anu mentions, that humanitarian policies push the refugees into sedentarism, it's interesting to read the stories in this book to see how what it means for Somali refugees to be locked to one land, to one place, to one space, and what does it mean to construct an architecture of refugees and humanitarian settlement when once pre-colonized history was that of nomadism. To that question of history, I would like to ask Anu about her conceptual take on the relationship between architecture and temporality, and how that approach may help us decenter the Eurocentric assumptions about the field and practice of architecture. Does seeing architecture require seeing history? Does seeing architecture require seeing history of spaces? And one last question. Anu, you argue in the book to read a refugee camp as resistant to the politics of exclusion in favor of seeing different past and different future. This epistemic possibility is one of the reasons to study Dadaab. Studying with a contested architecture or territory as an object whose history extends over a much longer period than expected, produces historical methods that may profitably disrupt chronologies, regimes of historicity, geography, and other analytic. My question to you is, towards what kind of future and which past? Thank you.
Anu.
Okay. So from one Anu to the other, words of admiration and deep appreciation for writing, I think, a book that's bold, brave, and really beautiful. As Hibaz suggested, Anu's revising, I think, fundamentals of the field, but the book is organized around a couple of very simple questions. What is a camp? Who is a refugee? And what are the contingent relationships between camp and refugee, between the camp as presumptive modal structure associated with impermanence on the one hand, and the camp as instantiating the possibility for life-making, camp as event rather than object on the other. This interplay between the ephemeral, the everyday, and the extraordinary is a central concern across this book. And this book, unlike most, is a deeply self-conscious artifact, its own making, the relationship between word and image, the division of chapters by a repetitive staging of blank pages in color, I might note, and the use of color itself as a practice of critique, it seems to me, of the plan, the map, and forms of architectural flattening is noticeable. So Anu is herself the maker, doer, master, builder, architect. The setting, as we know, is Dadaab in northeastern Kenya, the world's largest humanitarian settlement, refugee camp, which is itself a constellation of smaller camps knit together over the course of time as civil war, Somalia, Sudan, economic dispossession, and long delays as refugees are held often indefinitely at transfer points, have together created conditions for the camp as permanent exception? Or is it that the exceptional conditions of crisis have become the new norm? That is, Anu uses refugee architecture to read emergency, and in turn uses emergency as a way to read the workings of the state. Emergency here as crisis time forefronts the non-continuous, non-linear character of time, the introduction of time as a category for architecture that gets threaded into built space to make it pulverizable, soft, or elastic. And she showed us this image, and I just want to remind us of this kind of haunting image that sort of starts us reading this book. So perhaps here we have Henri Lefebvre with his distinctions of space-time into domains of conceived, perceived, and lived, except that Anu begins with the lived and tries to move us to the concept history, to the conceived, and that all of these terms are being used here to reflect on how their limits are shown up in so-called refugee architecture. The migrant, the refugee, the aid worker, the architect as expert, humanitarian aid, Cold War politics, and most important of all, the refugee home, whether makuti or tukul built with sticks, covered with cloth or mud and wattle, each is an actor in this remarkable story. And as we're told, these built forms are neither precarious nor evanescent and fleeting, but they are of the earth, they are made from the land, and they form heritage, or they form part of a narrative of heritage. They are remnants, themselves a memorial to long histories of movement and making and the kind of knowledge that comes with it. But perhaps, as Anu herself reminded us, it's land, borderland and frontier, land partitioned, material from land, and its use for homemaking, land marked by clan, lineage, and community, and of course, land as property, as commodity, as the main actor, the material substrate and animating element that the architecture takes for granted rather than making visible or pertinent. And here, of course, it's the category of labor, of making and doing, of bringing into relief, of thinking about the artifact itself as made object that is forefronted across the book, both as an emergent aesthetic and itself a form of making do, the just enough, as Hiba was talking about. And we are, of course, reminded here of earlier practices, histories, body memories of enclosure, partitioning, enclaving, colonial practices of both gathering and dispersal. Anu specifies the context and the methods for emergency knowledge formation, I want to suggest. Especially significant are the everyday insurgent practices here of refugee women, who are the intellectuals, they are the thinkers and the doers. Gendered labor, affective economies, and life-making is prioritized, rather than the standard narratives of criminality, terrorism, piracy, and African failed states. I'm going to read small sections just so that you can get a sense of Anu's voice in this book. She tells us shelters in Dadaab were planned, designed, and construed by trained architects, as well as unlicensed builders. Figures who have constructed emergency shelter environments powered by insurgent domesticities. The insurrectionary quality of those domesticities stems in part from the work of emergency homemakers to extract intimacies and comforts from a system that impedes critical forms of inhabitation. One that narrates privacy and interiority as luxuries rather than necessities, and does not imagine such luxuries for such homemakers. Domesticity offers a theory that moves beyond consigning displacement to the domain of lack. As an affective element in the life and vitality of migrating people, the basis for politics in Dadaab, and a driving force in humanitarian settlement, domesticity constitutes a core spatial strategy and a material practice used by people who've been displaced. The entire story that she tells us in this book is a story of the post-Cold War formation, a time when international agencies become more assertive and when nation states appear more legitimate, but simultaneously come under increasing vociferous pressures. Anu spent some time describing the camp, that quintessential structure of impermanence, as itself the occasion for gathering, convening, and homemaking by other migrants in deep, evocative detail. Rather than ephemeral and otherwise, the camp becomes a fact on the ground. It makes a claim to space and presence around which other infrastructures of sociality take shape. The camp thus inaugurates a relationship with semi-permanent communities, migrants who've not made it into the camps, traders who trade goods within the camp, but often also purchase humanitarian branded goods, huts, latrines, tarp, which are then erected outside the camp, making the camp's inside and its outside both fungible and uncertain. The built environment is composed of contradictions, she tells us. Dadaab has signaled transience through spectacular visual frailty, dwellings clad in recovered textile and sheet metal fragments, dusted red by the earth and wind. Yet Dadaab's equally dazzling substance, an array of satellites and their dishes, aeronautic fleets resting on tarmac, all-terrain vehicular convoys, aluminum and polyvinyl chloride water storage towers, hydraulic extraction machinery, and the large settlements themselves, anchors hard infrastructures in the earth and the sky. And in many ways, Anu Siddiqi is teaching us to see this camp in her own voice and words and to see otherwise. I want to take us for a moment elsewhere. The urban sociologist and founder of Bombay University's famous Department of Sociology, Patrick Geddes, described the chawls or the tenements of Bombay as sites for warehousing people. Overcrowded and underserviced, the chawl embodied the contradictions between labor abundance and housing scarcity, which was a market feature of industrial capitalism in Bombay in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. But what was more interesting here was what lay outside the tenement. You'll see the connections in a minute. Many Dalits and members of lower castes lived in tin sheds, created by hammering out kerosene tins after they were opened and fitted together, or in zavlis, huts made of dry leaves of coconut of date palm. Built in long rows like warehouses, the roofs covered with rubbish and a thin tin wall providing privacy between sheds, these places had no access to water taps or lavatories. And I'd like to think here with Anu about the way in which the camp itself becomes the occasion for new practices, not just of homemaking, but I think of new spatial and visual architectures. She showed us, I think, another photo, but maybe I will lose this. But this was the second map that she shows us, which is the photograph that she shows us, which is the design view of the camp that you showed us, kind of spread out across the horizon, all those tiny dots that you see. And all I'm trying to suggest here, I think, is that the camp itself, as ephemeral and impermanent, becomes the occasion for new practices of producing infrastructure around it. And I want to also ask about these histories, the complex relations between the camp, the refugee camp, the humanitarian settlement, and the so-called slum, practices both of incarceration and opening, but the forms, the spatial typologies, look very much like each other. So what's happening with these discordant yet convergent histories of homemaking and of kind of colonial enclosure, enclaving, and opening is, I think, what I'd like to ask. The second, the co-presence then of the chawl in these numerous makeshift shelters was a constant presence. The proximity between the unintended and the intended city, between formally constructed buildings, even if they're planned by architects thinking about refugee housing, and unplanned or intermediary structures, that is the slum, is a term that names the precarious work-in-progress character of much subaltern inhabitation elsewheres, begins to suggest strange proximities. The resulting tension, where urban infrastructure, colonial public works, post-colonial typologies of settlement and humanitarian relief, rely on a parastructure, I want to suggest, of unplanned and unregulated spaces as their very conditions of being. This is partially an example of what Malik Simone has called people as infrastructure, where economic collaboration amongst residents, seemingly marginalized from and immiserated by economic life, is characterized by flexible, mobile, and provisional intersections that operate without clearly delineated notions of how the city is to be inhabited or how the camp is to be used. Or what the economist Kalyan Sanyal characterized as a relationship, a symbiotic one, between capital and non-capital, with the former preying on the latter for its life force or vitality. One final point. In 1943, in We Refugees, Arendt would argue that refugees expelled from one country to the next represent the avant-garde of their people. For Arendt, as we know, the refugee is the sole category in which it was possible today to perceive the forms and limits of a political community to come, what it would mean to abandon without misgivings the basic concepts in which we've represented political subjects up to now. And of course, the paradox here is that it's precisely the figure that should have incarnated the rights of man par excellence, the refugee, who constitutes or brings that concept to crisis. If in the system of the nation state, the refugee represents such a disquieting element, and its European history is such a disquieting element, it's above all because by breaking up the identity between man and citizen, between nativity and nationality, the refugee throws into crisis the original fictions of sovereignty. But here, in Anu's narrative, in a post-Cold War regime, where the conceit of the rights-bearing subject itself is a figure to come, I wonder what kinds of stories, what lessons we might take away from this figuration of the refugee, her long histories, not merely as inhabitant and dweller, but as doer and maker, and the everyday, the fugitive, and the subversive archives through which she is brought into, she's brought to life, one might say, in this beautiful book as a percept or as a perceptual category that's becoming a concept.
And Miriam.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's such wonderful to listen to all these fabulous comments and learn more about the book as I listen. So Architectures of Migration is an erudite and deeply insightful book. It's creative and it's politically stunning. I have to admit, I read it in the review stage, and then now I read it again in its beautiful architectural form. And I have to say, each time I've been just amazed by the way Anu takes us out of predictable frames, rewriting the way we look at the world. So she develops the brilliant concept of an architecture of migration to guide the book. That is, she uses the condition of migration as a method to study settlement. In this way, she flips our perspective. So on the one hand, this echoes or follows an autonomy of migration approach, which puts migration and mobility at the heart of the human experience and treats it as an ontological condition. But drawing on an eclectic, creative, and ethically informed set of feminist methodologies, Anu takes it farther by using migration or movement to help us differently understand ideas of fixity, like domesticity, infrastructure, land, and even history itself. While writing about conditions of supposed emergency, Anu successfully uses the materiality of architecture to take us out of the temporality of crisis. Very hard to write about humanitarianism and not talk about crisis, but she does not. And shows that history exists for everyone, and argues that by recovering or partially reimagining these material histories, we open the way to alternative futures. So I want to just mention now, as everybody else has, I'm going to take three, I guess, major interventions. There's so many of them. These are just a few picked out, and then ask a question. So first, I want to point to the way Anu theorizes enclosures and turns the idea of the naturalness of nation states or borders on its head. Instead of looking at the way camps are carceral formations and exceptions to nation states, and instead of looking ahead to the future to build no borders worlds, Anu backs up in history and imagines the landscape as unpartitioned, land as a shared whole. Insofar as the autonomy of migration people take human mobility as the primal ontological condition, Anu focuses on the primacy of unpartitioned land beneath these political and architectural formations. That is, she imagines by looking in the past and uses the concept of partition as the way to disrupt our vision of the world. Rather than nation states, we see a series again of partitions. The refugee camp is simply one more instance of such a partition and enclosure. As part of this, she traces how, with the racial capitalist drive to sedentarization, how the nomad has been pathologized. She shows how enclosure and sedentarization are the logics of settler colonialism, as well as the justification for humanitarian settlement. Nevertheless, she shows that there are migrants whose relation to the land lies outside the paradigm of the nation state, and she recovers these transnational imaginations. One side of the story has been told as that of the commons. For instance, in 17th century England, this describes the situation of the diggers, whose common land was stolen by being enclosed by new practices of private property. The diggers argued for the right to the commons for everyone, and this set of collective shared practices is now being reclaimed by activists, scholars, indigenous folks, Black and brown folks, feminists, and so on. But Anu adds to this story by showing that this is not just a kind of a simple, Euro-capitalist story or history, but one of settler colonialism. It's not just about class, but about gendered and racial formations. And most importantly, it's about land, not just about kind of what grows on the land, as you said. My own work thinks beyond nation states as containers, or tries to, that keep people in or out and that serve as the primary sites of either political belonging or exclusion, because they've primarily produced a world order based on inequality. So I do argue for a no borders world in this sense, and have worked with people on the move and others to both identify and speculate with other forms of being and being together. And I have contingently thought of these as commoning. But I look to the present and work to surface and produce a different future. Anu does not imagine by looking to the future necessarily, but by looking backwards in history, creating a different starting point for us, a pre-partition state of potentiality. By grounding this not only in political formations, but in the land itself, we can start to imagine a different way to undo nation states and their carceral manifestations. She gives me a different way to do this. And by showing how housing itself can resist sedentarization, namely, she focuses on the tukul form, she points to fugitive architectures that can lead the way to more fluid worlds. So another of the books, so one of them is about enclosures and borders and partitions, and another one of the book's major strengths in political interventions is the focus on race and racism in the history of the refugee camp. Well, there's certainly some scholarship on the imbrication of humanitarianism and colonialism and humanitarianism and racism. Anu tells a much richer, nuanced story here. For instance, rarely is there mention of the way the Portuguese slave trade with Africa grounded the city of Lisbon during its infamous 18th century earthquake. But she brings it in to subsequently ask, can we imagine these humanitarian scenes without the African bodies that co-construct them? And they've been written out of all these histories. Similarly, in chapter 1, she gives a wonderful analysis of partitions of the land and the self in Dadaab, showing how partitions of the self for refugees involve a racial architecture of doubling, of having to tell certain racialized stories to be recognized as refugees. Even more insightfully, she argues that race might be apprehended as a form of architecture. Again, while people have written about a market in refugee narratives, I don't think anyone has analyzed it so clearly using the framework of, as she said, W.E. Du Bois's double consciousness and a partitioning of the self. Finally, we see how early abolitionist missions in Kenya helped to shape humanitarian architectures of enclosure, trying out the logic of rescue and rescuer in their attempt to provide protection for formerly enslaved people. People were confined for their protection in logics of missionary imperialism, which worked alongside the anti-slavery movement. So these are such important stories for understanding the nature of humanitarianism, but also for understanding nation-state formations and borders, kind of putting race centrally. Finally, Anu's book is ultimately a work of creative futurity by remaking the past. It's both critique and creativity. She not only writes about the ways Dadaab, the camp, has been erased from history, but as a counter to this, she actually produces a different future by producing an archive of Dadaab herself, surfacing its stories through space and time by way of images and very difficult to find documents. This is particularly apparent in chapter 4, but she also does this in the afterword by commissioning or putting together an exhibition of works by artists and people in or related to the camp that visualize a different world. All the way through, Anu uses the methods of Black and transnational feminists and the speculative techniques that demand we see fugitive architectures and construct our own futures with these as the frame. So I just have, I have a number of questions, but I'll end with one. I love that this is not based on classical ethnography. It is just a rich myriad of kind of methodologies and ways of engaging with this material. And I love that you write it in ways that are embodied and grounded and spatialized. And I love that you have worked to develop intimacy with Dadaab rather than analytic distance. This is something that Anu puts forward, that she uses a method of intimacy, actually. And so I wanted to ask about this method of intimacy and its relationship to solidarity, because you talk about a method of intimacy and you talk about sharing domesticity. So what does this mean, actually? You know, what does it involve as opposed to being in solidarity with people? I mean, as we know, intimacies can be violent. So is this what you intend by this? I mean, throughout you are very much in solidarity. I think intimacy and solidarity blend together. But so I want to know more about the politics and the political stakes of using intimacy as the way in, and what might get left out by this approach, right? So thank you so much for such a wonderful book.
Anu, that's a lot of questions. You don't need to answer all of them. But take from them what you want to answer and respond how you will, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
There's no way to really thank you all, so I won't try a very small thank you, but I'll try to spend the rest of my career with some big thank yous. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you've all had this experience, so maybe you know how gratifying it is to have people read something you've written and understand it the way you've written it, enough to be able to ask you the questions that matter the most. So thank you for that. Hiba, what does it mean to recognize this as architecture, and where are we going with architecture, which is not unlike asking, what are the political stakes of a certain kind of a method. It's a little bit of a different question, but I do think that, I grappled a lot with the fact that I just used the word architecture incessantly in this book without ever once saying what architecture is. That really bothered me, and also I felt like it would really be the wrong thing to tell people what they should think architecture is in a book like this. I think everyone needs to bring what they bring to that. Some people have a very de facto assumption of the term. Some people see it as straight up colonial. Some people have a very open idea of what it is, see it as a scaffold term. For me, it was very important simply to make this paradox, this oxymoron of an architecture of migration. I think at the root of that was really just this idea that we all effectively, I think I said this in class to some students today, we all, if you want to get a PhD in architectural history, you name archives that you will visit, and all of those official archives are predicated on landed wealth. And we don't ever assume that a set of archives that can tell you something about a spatial history could come from anything other than that. I don't mean we don't assume. Of course, everybody assumes and everybody wants to find other ways of writing and all that. But what I mean is that we need more ways of legitimating those other things. And for me, the rhetoric of architecture, using architecture in all its valences, was one step toward that, but also pairing it very closely with migration in order to always be showing that this is a term that has come to stand in for fixity, and it doesn't have to. I mean, you know this very well, this concept. So I think that to recognize this as architecture, maybe when I started, it was important to me to confer that recognition, but I don't think that that's actually what it's been about in the longer run of this research. I don't ever think I'm in any position to be the recognizer. I don't think any of us are, but I do think that there is this interplay of what gets recognized as what, and the questions that I think, Anu, you raised of, what is a camp, what is a refugee, are also questions of who's asking those questions and who gets to ask those questions, and in what context do those questions get asked. And I also felt that there, by keeping these things constantly in tension and constantly in play, we could be in this negotiation where the job is to ask. And that's what we should be doing. We don't have to have the answers. And in fact, the answers may not really matter. I don't think I have a very good response to this politics of just enough. the, Anu, how did you put it? You said something very similar, but it was a kind of, oh, you said the politics of making do. I do understand that that's a lot of the way we might describe the provisional life and provisioning. I do think that that is a lot of the labor that people do in emergency environments or contexts of emergency. What I really wanted us to do was lift ourselves out of an understanding of just seeing this as an object and instead understanding it as a process. I do think valorizing that labor does another thing. It shifts our view a bit. It suddenly makes the work not petty. It makes it the world. And I do think that that's what homemaking fundamentally is. And these are people who are homemakers in all sense. I mean, we all actually are. We just are made to think that we're living in a way that isn't, threadbare. But I wanted to move to this thing, Anu, that you said about the book itself. I think Duke, as many people who work with Duke, everyone comments on the wonderful design. And I did have many conversations with the designer. I don't think, I think they might have fired me if they could have, but I don't think that, I don't know what to say about this issue of color as critique, because I didn't come up with the color. The artist, I did come up with the artwork for the cover, and then this designer very beautifully, threaded it throughout the book in ways that I think were, again, as the three of you have done, someone responds to something that you've done and shows that they understood it. It is a quite moving experience. And so I honestly didn't know what to say when I saw the first iteration, because I thought, that's exactly what I mean. I mean that this is a beautiful place on earth. And if we're going to talk about it, let's talk about it with these very, very beautiful colors, just to show you all, like really threaded throughout the book. She did these very simple stops between pages. But I think that, this issue of creating a kind of objet d'art wasn't the point, except that as it became clear to me that there were many, many moments in the last 14 years that I've been working on this book that there have been threats of closing down the camps. Its ephemerality has been very real. And so there have been many moments where I've also realized, like, I really, if I publish these photographs, they might actually mean something much more than, they were never only going to be illustrations, but they might mean something much more than simply, marking a moment for this site. They might in fact be the only documents left of this site. And so I think I had a real sense that I needed to wait and let this book become something that could be, revered in a different way, in a kind of aesthetic way. I've had many arguments especially with art historians about this, because, this approach of preciousness can also be scandalous, like it can, given the subject matter. So it can also be taken, it can be very difficult. But I also think, maybe I speak out of a present, just deep sadness that maybe many of us feel right now. I do think we need beautiful things in the world. And I do think that we need to talk about people, and not just talk about their worlds, but make their worlds, make beautiful things that help us all remember their worlds. And so for me, that at some point became non-negotiable. And Miriam, I think, you've hit at the things that I think intellectually were the very, deepest registers for me. I'm in a field that I think in architectural history, there has been a long, slow march to bring, I think the studies of modern architecture have been so much informed by various leftist movements for, a couple of hundred years now, but the land politics that I think have now really come to the fore in different ways as an important body of theory, as well as important, real like political stakes for the world. I think that I've been really grappling with the lack of discussion of that in my field, but also maybe the surge of discussion of that as well. And it's been it's been incredibly important to me to really understand, as I think all of you do know, and I'm glad, Miriam, you noted my, relationship to ethnography, because people always tell me I'm an ethnographer, and I always tell them thanks, but I don't think I can call myself that. But anyway, I think that one of the things I have always thought was that one of the reasons I wanted to get to know Dadaab with people for whom it was home was a sort of sense of solidarity. And it really had to do with understanding a kind of way of being with the land. And we could say that people who live in Dadaab have had to live on the land in this way because they didn't have enough aid, or they didn't have enough provisions, they didn't have enough ways to build. And I think I showed you at least one built structure that is, I think a higher quality of residence than anything in the region, really, a humanitarian initiative. But I think that the issue has also been that I've been really wanting to understand something like a commons and what it would really mean for us to have an intellectual commons, even with people who, we can't be connected to. So, that was a thought. My comment on intimacy really is a way of understanding the work, a way of understanding ethnography, but also a way of understanding what I'm trying to do. I do understand the violences of that intimacy. I do think I myself was educated within colonial frameworks. I understand what it means, I think, to be really looking closely at something, and yet, I get to leave at the end of the day. I think these are all things I go to bed with every night. So I think intimacy is the right word. I've thought about this a lot with all of these valences, and I think that we have to start naming these things in order to do our work. I had seen it as a failing and a flaw for many years, but I've grown to really understand that it is the texture of the work, and so that's really where I think is the best place to start.
Thank you very much. We're running over time, so we only have time for about 5-10 minutes of questions. There will be a reception to follow, which we hope you can come to. But any questions for Anu from the audience? Also, we'll have a microphone that will pass around. So if you have a question, hold on a few beats until you get the microphone.
Thank you so much, Anu. Can you hear me okay? This is not a very well-formed question, but you mentioned scandalous arguments with art historians or scandalized art historians. I'm not sure, but
that's what you got out of all of this.
No. What was coming, what I was thinking about as you were talking was that you mentioned in your opening remarks that one of your concerns was the entanglement of aesthetics and politics. And I was so struck by that gorgeous photograph that you opened with, that you took yourself. And we've talked a bit about the aesthetics of the book, but I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that relationship in particular, and maybe how your approach to it developed over the course of working on the book. And if that ties into these debates with art historians, I would also be very interested.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's maybe that was the wrong way of saying that, but it always gives me a little bit of a palpitation when one of the photos is beautiful. I think I also think it's equally pretentious to only have the B-roll photos, which I've also done, because I sometimes think it needs to be very clear I wasn't a voyeur. I wasn't framing a photograph. I never frame. I'm not a good photographer, so I don't think that I actually have that skill. But I think that some of these questions, particularly, I mean, maybe talking about photography is always intrusive, so it's not the right thing to focus on. But I do think about whether images should be treated as precious or not, and that's maybe a bigger thing. But then it just became such an ordeal simply to get anything that I could think of as an archive or just any document at all. It really was a matter of chasing things to the end of the earth to get something that could be evidentiary in the ways that we're trained to understand them. So I found myself, making a little shrine to every little thing I found. But I feel like the overriding decisions I ultimately made were really just to honor the people who are at the center of this book and not worry so much about whether something was beautiful or not. But I do think, I think that people who are committed to the study of art history, who are really entangled in its colonial histories and all that, as you know quite well, I think will have to deal with this. And I think that it was sort of doubly complicated working in Africa with people who themselves are racialized in different ways. And I think having to translate that to working in North America, where there's a racialization of this kind of an object of study to begin with, all of those things kind of complicated the questions. So that's why I think I overthought it. But I think that, had I simply been, a student if I had been a student in Africa, working in Africa, I might have not thought about all these things so much. I do think it was having to translate between institutional environments that created this particular anxiety. I don't know if it's a legitimate anxiety either, but it has been things that, I mean, people have brought this up before. People have criticized me both for not having beautiful images and also for having beautiful images. But I think it's a burdened subject, and especially images associated with this subject are burdened. But, maybe we're well beyond that.
Shirley.
Thank you. And so I have to present the defense of your overthinking, right? Which is, I think this is to do with both. I was very struck by Brian's introduction of you, where he said you were constitutively collaborative. And to Miriam's, what is this practice of intimacy? And so I want to talk about another image you showed us, which is beautiful, which is that you invited artists to make maps. And to me, that is a very aestheticized, but also a very intimate spatial imagining. And what does that undo both about these worlds, I think, that you're grappling with, both about art and architecture, in arguing for intimacy as a way of negotiating space and knowing space in these alternative or primate or immediate map-making practices?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. It's a really good question. I think, yeah, I mean, that was one of the reasons one can just end a book But instead of ending it, I then decided to go and work with a bunch of artists. And I really think I did that because I thought, oh, if the arguments in this book are correct, then someone else will be able to take their own practice and see them through. And this was maybe my biggest test about solidarity, because I wanted to approach people who weren't at all, typically to work, there were a lot of ways to do this. I could have done a project in the camps or tried to find a way for the UNHCR to, help me do a project with refugees or something like that. And I thought instead, actually, I would like to work with people who are entirely unconnected from this endeavor, who actually might not even know, they live in Nairobi, but they might not even really know anything about Dadaab or care. But they are concerned artists. They do collaborate just by way of all their processes. This is the only way they work. And they were architects as well. And they, had a politics of solidarity. And so I just thought, if we put that together, maybe we will see something, that extends this story in a different way. So that was actually a pretty important that was an objective for me, I would say. Thank you for
I'll take one more question. That's fine.
Hi, thank you everyone. Just as Hiba mentioned that refugees, they live in a camp for decades and they barely survive and they don't live in past anymore, not future, just the present, right? So my question is it's not how many human can survive, but what kind of existence is possible for this who do survive. Thank you.
That's the general question. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. I think maybe I'll just parse it a little bit by saying, maybe Hiba, I think you meant, it's not that refugees live in the present. It's that temporality is imposed upon them. I don't think that anybody lives without a past and a future. As for lives that people experience or what is possible, these things to me are always historically conditioned, and they're just different in every historical situation. Every, camp context is different. I don't think that it's a typology in that sense. But one thing that became important for me to start understanding was how the environment, how that built environment had pasts and futures. And it's not that built environments are separated from people. Of course, the people in it are the history, but it became really important to me to start framing a question around how do we understand the past and the future of a place that has been constructed by people, and their constructions in the present that we know relate to these other constructions in the past, these kinds of precedents that we can dig up, that we can learn about, or futures that can be imagined by people who aren't even connected to the place. That to me became a method for being able to answer a question like the one you're asking. It's not about any individual people, but it really was about architecture in the end. Again, getting back to architecture.
But just to follow up, because you talk a lot about hope in the book, like you feel like from a feminist methodology and abolitionist methodology, and you talk about these things. So where do you locate hope? Like what kind of hope? I mean, I'm really curious.
I know. I'm sorry. I know we all.
I really want to.
We all need a little hope. I don't actually. Do I use the word hope?
I'm looking for hope. That's why I saw it.
I don't know how I feel about hope, and if I wrote the word hope, I don't know how I feel about it now. But I do think that we can be together, and that's what I think this is about. I think this book really is about being together with people, and I don't know if that's always hopeful or not hopeful. I mean, it is the double-edged intimacy issue, but I do think it is about, I mean, in that sense, it is about a collaboration, but I think that what I really learned, because a lot of people in Dadaab talked to me, they did not have time. I have no idea why anyone spoke to me at all. I mean, I don't mean it in the sense that like life is only urgency and only in the present, but these were people dealing with quite serious issues, and yet they were willing to give interviews or spend time with me, let me babysit their kids for a little while. I mean, there was really just a lot going on at all times, but I do think that this thing, it really is about being together with people, in whatever form that takes. And there's an architecture to that.
Abdulmalik Simone, early on, during the height of structural adjustment in Africa, wrote that the need to survive never overwhelms the need to imagine. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, panelists, for your comments. And thank you, Anna.